thank you all for coming here today. Right now I'm going to talk about a puzzle. It's a puzzle in political economy, actually. That you've got these disasters that happen, natural disasters, earthquakes, fires, floods, hurricanes. Sometimes, if they're big enough, large enough, they wipe out whole communities to completely destroy them. What we know in economics about incentives and how they work might suggest, probably should suggest, that these communities don't bounce back, don't come back from these kinds of disasters, but then we see them coming back. Within a decade or so, most of the communities that have been devastated in these kinds of ways do bounce back. And so a question that my colleagues Stephanie Heffley-Balch and Laura Grube and I try to answer in this book is how they come back. Entrepreneurship as being one of the potential answers to that question. And so I spent August 29, 2005, like many people I think in the United States, glued to my television set, basically watching New Orleans get beat up by Hurricane Katrina. And then I spent the days that follow watching what was already an horrific kind of tale unfold. So I'm a Bahamian from the Bahamas. It's a place that hurricanes happen all the time. And so I'm an experienced hurricane watcher. I've been watching hurricanes, in fact, my whole life. That I remember some of my earliest memories of being, a 4-year-old peeping out of a shuttered window, watching, trees being blown, from side to side and debris, flying about. So I'm an experienced hurricane watcher, and I will tell you that I had not seen anything before that August 29th that I saw that day. There was a city, anyway, for time the pictures finally came out, a city almost completely underwater, more than a dozen feet in some areas. That people stranded on rooftops, that their streets that were once streets now rivers, with signs stenciled on their roofs like "Please help" or "Save me." People wading through, images of people wading through waist-high water, sometimes carrying a garbage bag that you knew had everything that they managed to save from their home, sometimes carrying a small child, even a more sort of desperate and horrific scene. And then eventually, the scenes that you saw coming out of the Superdome and the Convention Center, which were the official disaster evacuation sites. Scenes that, quite frankly, don't make sense as American scenes. They're sort of scenes that sort of remind you of scenes that you see from, other countries and that are way poorer and that sort of certainly aren't as developed as the U.S. Masses of people who had been so obviously already beaten by the storm were now being, let down by the official emergency relief services. And then we eventually got glimpses of the neighborhoods. Right? So homes missing roofs, some missing walls, some just foundations where homes used to be. And the question then was, for everybody, but became the question of the research that drove the research that supported this book, is can this community recover? And if it could recover, how would it recover? There's reasons, actually, as I said, the good political economy reasons to actually doubt that this community or any community suffering this kind of disaster, could recover. And one reason is that disaster recovery is, in fact, a massive collective action problem. So this is a concept that if you've done economics at, at least up to a certain level, you'd have encountered, but let me just sort of say what it is. That it's a circumstance where we could cooperate. If we could cooperate, we would all be better off. We'd all be advantaged if we could figure out a way to cooperate. But where it's in none of our individual interests to actually cooperate, to actually try to contribute to this joint effort, unless we were sure everybody else was going to contribute. It's a circumstance where you kind of want to be sure that your neighbor's going to pitch in too before you decide to pitch in. If you all pitch in, you're better off. But if you're the only one that pitches in, you're clearly worse off, and the collective good that you wanted doesn't occur. And there's a couple reasons why a disaster is a massive collective action problem. One, the costs of rebuilding are high, in some cases extremely high, some cases maybe even prohibitively high. Rebuilding a home takes certainly money, certainly takes time. There's a psychic toll of picking through damage, mementos and damaged possessions. There's also, of course, the opportunity cost of not starting your life over someplace else and going ahead and doing that. But while the costs of rebuilding are high, the benefits are at best uncertain. There are a ton of questions that you wish you had answers to, that you'd want to have answers to before committing to a turn that you just can't have answers to, in part because they depend on other people. Things like, what will this community look like in 5 years, 10 years after the recovery occurs? What business opportunities will exist? If I'm a store owner, will the customers that I used to sell to before, will they actually come back after this disaster? Will they be able to purchase my goods? Will I be able to find employees for my enterprise? It's a question that you'd want to have an answer to before reopening that enterprise that you just don't. Similarly, what kind of public services would be available? If you got a kid that goes to school that they used to like, or at least went to school that they used to like before the disaster, and now post the disaster, you can't be certain that school is going to come back, or if that school came back, that if it would be the same kind or quality of school that your child went to before. Will the social networks that you belong to, the clubs that you belong to, the churches that you belong to, will they be restored? Will they come back? Notice, too, that the worse the disaster, the greater the uncertainty. The more extreme the disaster, the harder it is to know answers to any of these questions that you want to know answers to. And the rational move when faced with that kind of circumstance is to really wait and see, right? To let other people be the people that come back and rebuild first. And once you're sure what the community is going to look like, you're sure what the environment's going to look like, then you return. But if that's the rational move for you, that's the rational move it turns out for everybody, is to wait and see, to never be the first mover. The cost to put it in game theoretic terms, the cost of being the first mover might be prohibitive. And if that's true, if you don't get first movers, then you don't get disaster recovery. Right? So this is the nature of disaster recovery. It shouldn't occur, but yet we see it occurring. And the collective action problem after Katrina seemed to be particularly pronounced. And yet the city is recovering, and part of it, most of it actually, 10 years later, has recovered. And so the question is how? And the answer that Stephanie, Laura, and I provide in the book is that the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur, for us, thought of in broad terms to include not just commercial entrepreneurs, but social and ideological, political entrepreneurs as well. The entrepreneur is the solution to our problem. The entrepreneur is the hero, as it were, to our story. In fact, it turns out to confess, and I'll do more confessing tonight, I'm a big fan of entrepreneurs. I think of them, even in normal times, as being heroic. Right? They risk their livelihoods, neglect their families on occasion, work ridiculous hours to give us the things that we want, the things that we need, the societies and the policies that we want. So think of somebody like a Steve Jobs. Right? He's dying of cancer, but yet he's working hard, tirelessly to get us the next generation of the iPad. Or think of someone like, think of a social entrepreneur like Martin Luther King, right? Willing to risk his life to get us civil rights. In normal times, entrepreneurs bring about technological transformation and social transformation and political transformation. And after disasters, we highlight in the book that they perform three, what we take to be really critical roles. That they provide needed goods and services. I'll talk more about each of these later on. They restore and replace disrupted social networks. And they signal that community rebound is likely and, in fact, already underway. So let me pause here for a little bit and give you a roadmap so you know where the rest of the talk is going. You sort of have a sense, you can follow the logic. Next thing I'm going to talk about is basically the challenge and the status of post-Katrina recovery, basically via a report card. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the broader project of which this book and this talk and the items that I'm talking about in this talk are part. And then I'm going to tell you stories of three entrepreneurs. And then if I have time at the end, I'll give some thoughts and brief thoughts about what the implications of this might be for public policy. And so the report card. Largest disaster in U.S. history in terms of loss of life, and 1,824 deaths. There was over $100 billion in property damage, well over half. The homes had something like severe damage to major damage. Severe damage is damage. And then hundreds of thousands left homeless, tens of thousands of businesses affected, hundreds of thousands of job losses. As you can see from the pictures, disasters were significant. Right? Again, a city almost completely underwater. And then when the water receded, this was the damage that people met. And so not surprisingly, recovery from this kind of disaster has been slow and is still, in some sense, incomplete. So prior to Katrina, Orleans Parish, which is the same as New Orleans, had over 200,000 active households. And by active households, that really just means there's a structure on, there's a piece of property, there's a structure on the property receiving mail. So at least one person is living there. So it doesn't mean that the house is even livable. For a long time after Katrina, there were trailers on the property that were receiving mail. It is a good sort of gauge of how recovery is and was going. It, in some sense, overestimates how quickly the recovery is going. And even there, by an overestimation, you get the recovery is slow. And so roughly a year afterwards, you still basically half the households that existed in New Orleans don't exist. 3 years out, we're around 72%. And then from there, it starts sort of building as a slow crawl. 2004 numbers are 89%. And though while recovery has been slow, it's also been uneven. So some communities are at pre-Katrina levels. Some actually have more homes and residents than existed prior to Katrina, and some are still struggling, hovering around 70%. Some are actually a little bit lower than 70%. Some, like the Desire neighborhood, which is right near where the levees broke, don't exist at all. They're just foundation. So we set out, it's not just me as part of a broader project at Mercatus that tried to look at this. The team set out to try to answer the question, why do people return? Like, why would you come back to rebuild here instead of building a life somewhere else? But also, more importantly, how do people overcome this collective action problem? Because again, the logic of the situation, the economic logic of the situation, suggests that this is a puzzle that should not occur. And so our approach was an interview-based approach. We used qualitative methods. We talked to 300 plus residents in the affected area. We talked to another 50 or so residents who had been former residents who'd been displaced and they were in Houston trying to come back. And we basically asked them 3 sets of questions. What was your life like prior to Katrina? What was the community like? What was the neighborhood like? We talked to them about their Katrina experience, and so we heard, in some senses, many horrific tales. And then the final thing was just, how did you come back? And really trying to understand and get at that question. And we got a couple of answers to the why and how question. To the why question, and I'll just quickly go over this because it's not really the bulk of my talk, but to the why question, really, it came down to a phrase that we heard over and over and over in the research was, there's just no place like New Orleans. Which, if you've been to New Orleans, you sort of know that that's true. That it's sort of hard. It was hard for New Orleanians to just imagine even a life somewhere else. And the literature is called a place attachment. There was a strong sense of place in New Orleans, and they just really wanted to come back. But to the how question, we found actually a diversity of answers. That my frequent co-author Emily Chamley-Wright and I, in other research, focused really heavily on the role of social capital. Turns out that social capital is really important in helping communities bounce back from disaster. And so both social capital in the form of social networks, which were sort of an important source of mutual aid and information about like a place to stay, how to receive funds, how to negotiate and navigate the disaster process, but also in the form of collective narratives, right? Just the kind of the stories that we tell ourselves and who we are. But the book, Community Revival in the Wake of Disaster, and what we're talking about today is focusing on the role of the entrepreneur. And as I said, the entrepreneur does 3 things, basic things. So the first one's kind of a pedestrian point, right? But disasters destroy things, and people need to replace the things that were destroyed in the disaster. And so one of the things that entrepreneurs do is they provide the goods and services that people need to replace the things that got destroyed in the disaster. Through their businesses and their charities and their sort of other efforts. And so the contractors that help to build the buildings, or the places where they buy the furniture or they buy the food and what have you that they need, the clothing that they need to be replaced. They also, though, restore and replace disrupted social networks. That one of the things I mentioned is that more than half the New Orleans residents ended up someplace else after the disaster. But also recall that I said that social capital seemed to be really important. People relied on their social networks for information. They relied on it for aid. And so you had this situation where you had social networks that were disrupted and disbanded and people evacuated to multiple sites, and you also had a real need for social capital. So one of the things that entrepreneurs did was that they helped to reconnect these disrupted social networks. And I'll tell you a story about LaToya Cantrell and how she did that. And then the final thing is that they did is to help communities overcome the collective action problem that is disaster recovery, is that they actually acted as first movers. That they were willing to bear the cost of being first movers to this kind of problem. That they encourage people, they return first themselves, and they encourage people through their efforts to come back as well. So let me tell you 3 stories. The first story I'm going to tell you is about an individual named Casey Kasem. At the time, he was the owner of Discount Zone. He since sold it, but at the time, he was the owner of Discount Zone. Is in the 9th Ward. If you've seen, say, Spike Lee's Where the Levees Broke, or you've basically seen much of the coverage related to Hurricane Katrina, a lot of the horrific images are from the 9th Ward. 9th Ward is in particular, the lower 9th Ward where the Discount Zone is located is overwhelmingly African-American communities, about 98% black community. That it's also one of the poorest neighborhoods in New Orleans, and so it has some of the social ills, or at least had some of the social ills that you expect in disadvantaged communities. But it also had this really high levels of home ownership. About 60% of the people owned homes in the 9th Ward, and it had high levels of place attachment. That when you talk to people from the 9th Ward about the 9th Ward, they talk about how close-knit the community is and how special that community was. And so Casey, after Katrina, let me back up a little bit. 9th Ward, I also should say, is, I mentioned that it was where the levees broke. It also suffered some of the most severe damage. So it was the site of multiple levee breaches. You had 20-foot storm surges that passed through that community. It had flooding of 10 feet on average throughout the whole neighborhood. That 3,000 of the 4,700 houses in the neighborhood were beyond repair at the time after Katrina happened. And the residents were kept out. Actually, they weren't allowed even to return to see their damaged homes for 3 months after the storm. So Casey, in 2003, had decided that he, despite some of the disadvantages, so before Katrina, despite some of the disadvantages that he saw in this community, thought that this was a place that he wanted to invest. So he built a $2 million facility that had just about everything. It was a one-stop shop for everything the community needed. And so it was a gas station, but it also had a convenience store. It also had a laundromat. It also had a takeout restaurant. On the 2nd floor, it also had a couple of apartments and space for office buildings. Casey, in fact, was a hero. So when the storm is hitting, he decides first to, he and his wife decide that they're going to weather the storm in the store as opposed to in their home. They send their kids to Texas with family. He's actually downstairs on the 1st level of the store when the levees are breached, and so the flooding's coming in, and he makes it outside the store, swims out of the store, actually makes it outside the store, and weathers the bulk of the hurricane in his boat. He decided, there may be a little bit of flooding. I know, New Orleans is a little bit under seawater, so I'm going to bring my boat from the lake to the store, and I'll just tie it up. He actually weathers the storm in his boat, and then eventually when the roughest weather passes, he climbs up to the 2nd story where his wife and a few of his employees and some community members already are. And then he reports, almost as soon as he gets there, hearing screams. There's screams coming from the neighborhood. So it talks about how terrifying and horrific those screams were. And so he decides he has to do something about it. So he goes out in his boat and starts pulling people off of roofs. He ends up saving 30 people, bringing them back from roofs back to the store, swimming back into the store to get food stuff to take upstairs for the more people that were there. So he's a genuine hero in the sort of classic sense of the term. But he also did something that was as important in some sense, very important at least for this community, And then he reopened the gas station, laundromat, convenience store, takeout restaurant, set of apartments as well. That at a time when you couldn't get, much of anything. When I first started visiting New Orleans, it was this kind of time. He had the place for this community where you could get a lot of, of the things that you needed. But this kind of thing, again, critical. If you're going to talk about how you're going to come back and rebuild after something like a Katrina, having a place to get gas for your car, having a place to eat at a time when you don't have a house and so you don't have a kitchen, having a place to get food stuff becomes particularly important. And so entrepreneurs provide needed goods and services after a disaster. Let me tell you a story about LaToya Cantrell, who's the president of the Broadmoor Improvement Association. Broadmoor is a community about 2,400 homes in central New Orleans. It's a historically diverse neighborhood. It's described as a microcosm of a city of the larger New Orleans. And so it has a huge range of diversity on a bunch of margins. It's about 68% African American, 26% white, about 4% Hispanic or Latino. It also has a bunch of economic diversity. And so you've got homes there, households there where the income is $10,000 a year, so below the poverty line, to people there who make households there that have $200,000 a year. So huge range of diversity. Really wealthy families, just a few streets down from really disadvantaged families. And the Broadmoor Improvement Association is this neighborhood association that existed. It existed since the 1930s. And its real effort was really about in the business of lobbying for public services, lobbying for a nicer park and those kinds of things as well. And LaToya, who had joined the board of that organization in 2003, became the president in 2004, just a year before the storm, just a year before Katrina struck. Although Broadmoor didn't have the 12 feet of flooding that you saw in some areas, that particularly the lower Ninth Ward, where I mentioned is 12 feet average. But almost every home in Broadmoor had flooding of some sort, and the water sat. It sort of took a week for the water to recede, and so it festered in those homes as you had the sort of attending mold and everything. The houses had to be completely gutted. As one person said, when they came back to the home, it's a complete, everything was destroyed. LaToya and the organization that she headed after the storm did two things that were really big deal. Remember, one of the difficulties after disasters is that you got disrupted social networks. Your neighbors are no longer your neighbors. Your neighbors now have been evacuated or relocated to Houston, Atlanta, Baton Rouge, as far as Washington, D.C., as far as Washington State. And so you've got this huge range of this sort of evacuations that took place all across the U.S. in many cases. And it's a hard time, it's a hard enough time knowing your neighbors in regular circumstances. It's certainly a really difficult time trying to figure out where your neighbor who you kind of have a tangential relationship with, or you have maybe even have a close relationship with, has been relocated after the storm. It was hard enough for people to know where their family members relocated after the storm. But the BIA, because it was a functioning neighborhood association, had a contact list. It had a list of people's emails and it had a list of people's phone numbers. And it used that structure to help the community recover. Under LaToya's leadership, she directed it to do that. And so it was able to do things like keep members abreast of developments that were going on back in New Orleans, and also with the other members. But another thing it did that was important is it lobbied it to resist the green dot. So I'm going to tell you about the green dot. It'll actually come up in the next story as well. So after Katrina happened, there was a commission that was set up in New Orleans. It's called the Bring New Orleans Back Commission. The aim of this commission was to figure out essentially a plan to bring New Orleans back. One of the things that they thought that would be a good idea for this plan is to reduce the urban footprint of New Orleans. And so they decided one of the ways to reduce the urban footprint of New Orleans was to just decide that certain things that used to be neighborhoods should now be parks, essentially. And so the Bring New Orleans Back Commission released their draft plan in late 2005, early 2006, and there was a map, and that map basically had, for some areas, had a green dot. And so where your neighborhood was now is a green dot, and the message was sent that, look, if you can't demonstrate that your community is viable, and by that they meant you can't get commitments from 50% of the people in that community to be back within, to at least begin moving back within 4 months, then this area is going to be a park. And so it would be recaptured, would become green space again. And so Broadmoor is one of those places, because of the level of damage, because how displaced people were, was designated to be a green dot, was designated to be green space. And so Latoya, again, and the organization that she headed, worked really effectively through this. They, first began contacting residents to say, hey, look, I know that you're just trying to survive wherever you've been moved to in Houston or Atlanta or wherever, but there's a real threat back here. If I can't get your commitment, your written commitment to be back within 4 months, there's a chance we won't actually ever be able to come back. And so she was able to keep them. But she was also able to connect people, and remember, there's a community that there's a huge diversity in terms of experiences. And so you had in that community people who worked in marketing. And so they were able to develop a marketing plan. She was able to mobilize them to develop a marketing plan. And so you saw these Broadmoor Live signs sort of all over, splattered all over the community. That you had people there that were adroit in grant writing. And so she was able to then mobilize them to begin writing grants to try to get them help and support, to do things including not just to help them prove their vitality, but to actually develop a revitalization plan of their own that would say that, no, not only we're coming back, and it's going to be a community-directed way to come back. This plan is actually so effective that it becomes, in the subsequent development plans for New Orleans, it becomes a part of that. They just adopt Broadmoor's plans. And so after disasters, entrepreneurs do things like restore and replace disrupted social networks. They actually reconnect people that have been displaced, and they help them to work together to solve the collective action problem that is disaster recovery. And the final story I'm going to tell you is about Father Vienne, who at the time of Katrina was the pastor of the Mary Queen of Vietnam Catholic Church. The Mary Queen of Vietnam Church and the community around it, church had about 3,800 parishioners in it at the time. The Vietnamese, American, they all traced their roots to some degree or another to 3 small fishing villages in North Vietnam. When the Vietnam War broke out, they ended up being relocated to South Vietnam. When Saigon fell, they ended up being brought over by Catholic Charities to New Orleans East, this community in the east part of New Orleans. As they sort of spread out from the places they were living, and they built up that community, they built the community with the church the Mary Queen of Vietnam Church at the very center of the community. And so about 80% of the parishioners lived within a mile of the city, and the church was the actual center there. But it was more than just a church, and you can tell by the location in some sense that it was also a space where they held cultural events. It was also a space where they had a farmer's market every weekend that sold Vietnamese goods and food stuff, that it was a meeting space and a social space for the older residents in particular in the community who would go to that church every day to reconnect with their friends. The Mary Queen of Vietnam community also, there was a community that had some of the worst flooding in New Orleans. The flood levels as high as 12 feet again. But despite the severe devastation, despite the severe destruction, the community was one of the fastest to rebound after the storm. Within 2 years, about 80% of the community had actually come back. Again, if you remember from the earlier graph, it's taking communities 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 years to get to that level. And so how did it do it? Recall that community recovery is a massive collective action problem, and one of the reasons it's a massive collective action problem is it would be really useful to know what others are doing and the choices that others are going to make, but you don't really have a good way to do that. Father Vienne, though, figured out a way to overcome that problem by basically acting as a focal point. So I mentioned that Casey, I talked about being a genuine hero, that Father Vianne's actually a genuine hero as well, that he, instead of evacuating, he ended up waiting out the storm in the schoolroom for the church with about 500 of his parishioners. Some were too elderly to evacuate, some just didn't want to evacuate. The storm hits, the hurricane passes, people think there's calm, they start going back to their homes. Turns out that that was essentially a false calm, because at that point the flood waters start rising. And so you've got people who've now gone back to their homes and they're about to now experience this, what would ultimately be 12 feet of flooding. And Father Vianne starts going out in a boat that was connected to the church and actually rescuing people through this. So risking his life to bring people back to the church. So he's actually a genuine hero. But he did two things that were pretty important to help that community bounce back. The first thing he did is he prioritized rebuilding the church. He sort of got the notion that the church was the center of the community, and if you rebuild the church, people will come back. And so as quickly as possible, he started holding Mass in the church. So 6 weeks after Katrina, he's all people, again, the New Orleans as a whole is a ghost town. New Orleans East is a ghost town. Homes are damaged and in poor shape. The church is missing an entire wall. He starts holding Mass. The first Mass on October 9th gets 300 parishioners out of the 3,800. The second Mass a week later gets a few more. By the end of the month, there are 2,000 parishioners that are coming back to these Masses from wherever they've been evacuated. So they're coming in just for the Mass and leaving. But he's not just having the Mass, right, that's sort of coordinating around return. He's also taking pictures of the parishioners and using those pictures to shame public officials into providing services. He's actually taking it to the power company and saying, hey, look, I've got 2,000 people that are prepared to come back, but the only reason they won't come back is because you won't turn on the electricity. Turns out that the power companies and the other utility companies were playing the same wait-and-see game that was rational for the individuals to play, right? Well, we're not going to invest in turning on power to your community until we're sure there are actually people in your community, and people in the community were saying, well, I can't move back to rebuild my home unless there's actually power for me to use to rebuild my home. And so they were playing the same kind of game. Father Vianne ended up getting them out of that game by shaming them into saying, look, I've got people that are here that are willing to return. But he also did something before that, before he started holding Masses. He very quickly knew that if you let people settle, that they might not return. And he wanted to coordinate the activity of his parishioners around return. So he started visiting. He and his assistant priest started visiting evacuation sites within days of Katrina. And they did two things. They took pictures of the people they saw, so that if someone was missing a loved one and they'd ended up at a different evacuation site, they were able to say, hey, look, you were, so-and-so is alive, that well, I saw them in Houston, what have you. But he also told them, look, the people I talked to at that site in, Baton Rouge, they said they're coming back, right? And he would tell the people in Houston, look, the people who, I talked to at that site in Atlanta, they said they're coming back. And he would do this game where he would tell basically everybody that everybody I talked to said that nobody I've talked to says that they're not coming back. And because they trusted Father Vianne, they all believed it. And so they all essentially understood that, look, Father Vianne says everybody's coming back. He says everybody he's talking to is coming back. Everybody's coming back. Now it makes sense to invest in this collective enterprise. Because now we know that everybody else is going to invest in this collective enterprise that we build in the community. And so we're going to do it. So he was able to serve as a focal point in that way to help communities bounce back. And so just some quick thoughts on public policy, and I'll stop there because I think I've talked long enough and I want to hear from you all. There's a couple of things that come out of this research. The biggest thing is that if in fact entrepreneurs play the role that I claim that they play, that we claim that they play in the book, then the biggest implication is that you've got to give entrepreneurs the space to act. You've got to stay out of their way, essentially. You've got to give them the room to do the kinds of things that Casey and LaToya and Father Vian did. The thing I didn't talk about at all in the talk, because I was sort of stressing the positive, they all ran into all sorts of barriers in their efforts to do that. That it took months for Casey to get the licenses that he needed to reopen his gas station. It took, LaToya again was competing against and fighting against the green dot. That she had to invest energy not in rebuilding, but in energy in trying to convince public officials to let them rebuild. That Father Vian faced all sorts of struggles. One, the Vietnamese American community that where they were located, that also had a green dot that they had to spend lobbying effort to try to overcome. But it's also the case that he had a hard time essentially convincing the official emergency relief services that they needed to be sensitive to the Vietnamese culture and the way that they would be comfortable receiving aid and the way that, and so he had to invest energy in doing that kind of thing as well. And so if I might, that entrepreneurship plays this important role, then the primary thing is giving them the space to act. There's a couple ways you can do that. One is to avoid top-down planning. Right? Don't release maps within months of a disaster saying that we're not going to let you rebuild. It's a sort of maybe sort of obvious thing to do, but it actually turns out that New Orleans, there were 5 comprehensive development plans released in the 5 years following the disaster. That not just creates a barrier to coming back, but and a barrier to entrepreneurs acting. But it also creates a lot of uncertainty on its own at a time when things are already uncertain. Because you're adding to the uncertainty, will we even be allowed to come back? If we do come back, will we really get power turned back on, all these kinds of things. Another thing I'll mention just really quickly here, and then I'll end, is that another thing might do is eliminate or suspend or simplify rules that actually hamper entrepreneurship. So I'll give you an example. So there's some rules that might make sense. I'm not necessarily advocating them, but you can maybe see the logic of them in mundane, regular times that just simply don't make sense after disaster. So one of those rules, my favorite, there's a rule in place or was a rule in place in New Orleans that regulated the amount of children that a particular daycare professional could service. And so you had to have the person at daycare, if you want to have a certain number of children, you had to have someone who had a certain set of experiences, but also they couldn't watch more than 5 kids at a time. So you might say, okay, in mundane times, in regular times, when there's a ton of competition for daycare centers and there's a ton of available daycare workers, that this is a kind of thing that might protect children, or that might make it so that children get the kind of care that they need, and it's a way to sort of guarantee or ensure that, perhaps. But after the disaster, this kind of thing is downright silly. You had daycare centers that wanted to open that couldn't open because the facility that they were in, by the way, that had just experienced a hurricane, wasn't up to the code that they were required to be in, and they couldn't find enough appropriately licensed, appropriately credentialed daycare workers. And so you had people who wanted to come back, who had young children, who couldn't come back because they were faced with the alternative of, they were denied the alternative of putting that child in a daycare that maybe had, twice as many students as it ought to have had, or of having the student in their, mold-infested construction site, gutting and then construction site that they were trying to rebuild and repair. So removing or simplifying or suspending rules like that after disaster are something that one might do as well. See, we didn't want to just tell a story of the people who came back. We wanted to understand what it was that was keeping people there. Some of them were quite frank. Look, my life is better in Houston than it was in New Orleans, right? And so it was a straight calculus about whether to come back or not. Many of them, though, wanted to come back. The majority of them actually wanted to return. And when they talked about why they didn't return, they cited essentially the collective action problem, but not in so many words. And so they would say things like, well, I want to come back, but the school where my kid goes isn't open yet, and so I can't come back yet. And this is 3 years after. It's 2008 that we're talking to them. Or I want to come back, or I would like to come back, but the church that I used to go to, just, the pastor left, or it's displayed, or whatever, and they've not reopened the church, and so that was really essential to my life here, and so I don't. If that were to come back, I would be back tomorrow. And so it was so you got those kinds of things that were the majority of people, particularly people who wanted to come back, that they would cite. That sort of spoke to, look, there really is this challenge of, if we could be sure that there was a commitment from everybody to make the community what it was or like it was, we would come back, but there's not that commitment. As a part of some of the rebuilding efforts, there was this sort of desire, okay, so how do we build homes smarter? So one of the reasons that you end up with a city that's 49% below sea level, but with homes built there, and a lot of homes built there, is the two ways. One, you end up with a certain set of judgments made about the levees that are keeping the Mississippi in check and preventing those communities from flooding. And so that's a challenge to begin with. The fact that the levees were supposed to be able to withstand the storm even greater than Katrina was when it hit landfall, but didn't. The way flood insurance works is that you get, you're either required to get flood insurance, and the levels of flood insurance you're required to get are based on these things called flood maps that were released by the federal government. And they assumed as well that the levees would work, and so there would be no flooding. And so you had all these people who built homes in areas where they didn't have flood insurance because flooding would not and was assumed not to exist. And so one sort of thing that, in fact, wasn't considered but probably should have been considered more is maybe let's actually sort of not make heroic assumptions about levees being able to do things that they've proven that they can't do, and maybe we should release flood maps that actually take into account the actual, and then the true cost of the homes would be the homes that the residents would face, and then they would make a decision about whether to stay or not based on that. And so there's an open question about whether people should be living in New Orleans. But so let's take that question aside. Another thing that they did, though, that actually did stand in the way of recovery is that they decided there were these rules that came down about how one should build a house, certain elevations, away from the street, these kinds of things. There wasn't the kind of clarity that you would want because those rules were often proposed rules that weren't implemented or what have you. And so you had residents that actually had to wait on the sideline to even sort out what the rules might be. They sort of like, because they were this sort of changing yardstick that seemed to be implemented throughout the process. And so those efforts existed, but those efforts took time to come into place. And then one of the things that even the attempt to try to come up with those kinds of things did was it slowed people's ability to rebuild.
So I was really struck by the examples you gave that some of the areas of the city are fully recovered at this point. A lot of them are still at only 70%. There are still some that are just no recovery of any kind. I was curious to what extent from your research is the difference in sort of how much the different areas have recovered, how much is that due to sort of the entrepreneurship of that particular area?
Yeah, so some of it certainly, it's a resource thing, and there are a lot of wealthier communities that were able to bounce back because they had access to resources quicker. So that's sort of a part of the story. But what we found is, so I can't talk about why the communities that didn't recover. What I can say is that the communities that did recover had evidence of these kinds of entrepreneurs really being active. And so it seems like entrepreneurship was particularly important in the communities that came back, and the communities that came back quickly. And they did the roles, the 3 roles that we talked about. That why we didn't see entrepreneurship in the communities that we didn't see it, or entrepreneurship that was robust enough to overcome the collective action problem, I don't sort of have a good sort of answer to that question. So probably shouldn't guess at it.
How does profit fit into what they're doing as well as from the social and entrepreneurs and things like that. What are the payoffs? What are the why is it that they're doing this, right? It's not while it may be they may be heroic in some ways, right? There's payoffs for them in other ways, and there's still profits of some type, right? That they're getting and things that they're getting out of this.
Yeah, so we end up talking about entrepreneurs as essentially change agents, right? So individuals and actors that bring about change. And the reason we do that is because even the crassest sort of commercial entrepreneur that you might imagine, maybe the greediest, that they tend to have not just monetary purposes in mind. That if you sit down and you talk to the owner of a business and you talk about what's the point of your business, it's not often the caricatures where they say, the point of my business is to make money. Most of them say something else. You get a different story, right? So I'll talk about a famous one. So you talk to Bill Gates about why he did what he did. He ended up being one of the richest people in the world, but you talk about why he did what he did. He says, well, no, I thought computers were really cool, and I thought that they were transformative to people's lives, and I wanted to figure out a way to make sure that more and more people had access to computers, and that was why I did what I did. Now, I made a bunch of money along the way, but that was sort of the purpose of it. So this kind of social purpose is a purpose that I think sort of is consistent across entrepreneurs, whether they're getting from their business actual monetary profits, or they're getting some sort of psychic satisfaction from the world is a better place than it was before.
I met a guy flying into New Orleans not quite a year after Katrina who had been there and saw a neighborhood that was starting to come back and noticed that there was no liquor store anywhere around. And he just thought, if I'm the first one to open a liquor store there, I'll make a killing. And so he was going there to open the first liquor store to come back to this neighborhood, because he thought, he would then be the liquor store for the neighborhood. And my question was, how much, your examples were great because they were kind of not what I think most people would think of right off the bat as entrepreneurs, because we tend to think of people starting a small business. Yours were much more cross-cutting. But how much of that kind of entrepreneurship drove a lot of this? People, seeing the recovery and chances to profit, like she was asking about, did that cascade in the same way?
Yeah, so in the book we talk about people who started coffee stores and restaurants and furniture stores and clothing stores and stuff like that for the same sort of purpose. Let me actually talk about something that we might have seen but didn't see because of the rules, though. That there's a rule that is in place in New Orleans that says that you have to be in, actually all of Louisiana, it says you have to be a licensed contractor in the state of Louisiana in order to build a home. You get a license to build a home, these kinds of things. And again, it's one of those rules that in mundane times might make sense, because it might protect, you can sort of imagine the scenario where the state has screened who the good contractors are and who the not reputable ones are, and so they're able to only license the good ones. And not, so you can sort of imagine that being something that might be true. I don't know that that's true, but you sort of imagine that as being something that's true. Now move to a circumstance where they're not just a few homes or a few hundred homes or a few thousand homes being built a year, but you got half the city that needs to be rebuilt. You need a lot more contractors. And so you need people from outside of New Orleans contractors from outside of New Orleans to come to New Orleans. But then there's this rule that says that you can't be a licensed contractor, you can't do licensed contract work in New Orleans unless you're a licensed contractor. And so then the reputable contractors from New Jersey and New York and Georgia and all these other places, well, they're not gonna break the law to go build homes in they're reputable contractors. They don't do that. And so the people who come in then are the less than reputable contractors who are willing to break the laws of the state of Louisiana in order to build homes. And so you end up with this scenario where, because of the rule, precisely the wrong entrepreneurs are the ones that show in. And you get then all this trouble with people who are already in disadvantaged situations, who are very desperate, who very much want to get their homes rebuilt, are now stuck with, I cannot rebuild my home, I can go with this potentially shady contractor. And so then, sort of one of the stories now it is post Katrina that was very popular was, yeah, there's all these shady contractors. Well, maybe there's a reason there's all these shady contractors, because the rules, there wasn't space for the legitimate entrepreneurs to act. It was a space that was created where only the disreputable, or many of the disreputable entrepreneurs would act. Thank you very much.